Welcome to the Explainer. Okay, let's just jump right into this because today we're unpacking one of the most phenomenal, almost unbelievable geopolitical and economic heists of the last 4 decades. We are talking about the incredible story of how a single nation completely transformed itself from the kingdom of bicycles into the undisputed king of global automotive manufacturing. And spoiler alert, this wasn't an accident. It was a meticulously calculated master plan. And the details are just absolutely fascinating. So here is our roadmap for today. We're going to start with that crazy transition from bicycles to a superpower, then dig right into the joint venture policy, explore their massive strategic pivot from oil to electric vehicles, and uncover the invisible global supply chain monopoly they've built up. After that, we'll look at a really eye-opening case study comparing India and China. And finally, we'll break down the catfish effect and what the future actually holds for the EV market. All right, part 1, from bicycles to superpower. Let's look at the reality of the 1980s. To really appreciate where we are today, we have to look at the sheer mind-boggling scale of the present reality. Think about this. In 2023, 4 massive titans of industry, the US, Japan, India, and South Korea, produced a combined 29 million cars. That's a lot, right? But in that exact same year, China alone produced over 30 million cars. They are literally outputting more vehicles than those 4 mega economies combined. And what's so wild about this is that back in the 1980s, when Western roads were absolutely packed with Fords and Volkswagens, China's roads were almost exclusively filled with bicycles. Back then, China had virtually no domestic passenger car manufacturing to speak of, so to meet any kind of demand, they had to import. And this perfectly illustrates the massive crisis they faced. In 1985 alone, China spent $3 billion on passenger car imports. To put that into perspective, their entire foreign exchange reserve at the time was only about $2.64 billion. I mean, they blew 1.3 times their entire national reserve just buying cars. This triggered a massive trade deficit panic among their leadership. They realized pretty quickly that if this kept up, it would utterly bankrupt their entire economy. Enter Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping. In 1986, after some really intense government debates, he officially drafted a strategic blueprint that declared the automotive sector as China's pillar industry. Now, you might be wondering, why cars? Well, it essentially boils down to these 3 highly calculated steps. First, geopolitics. Think about it. Aerospace belonged to the US and the Soviets, electronics to Japan, and oil to the Middle East. Automotive was huge, sure, but it wasn't completely monopolized by a single identity yet. Second, it's what's called a mother industry. Building cars requires steel, rubber, glass, electronics, so boosting cars automatically creates millions of jobs across dozens of other sectors. And third, easy accessibility. China already had an absolute abundance of cheap labor, vast land, and raw materials like steel and coal. It was just a perfect match. Moving on to part 2. Masterstroke, the joint venture policy and the WTO compromise. Okay, so declaring a pillar industry on paper is easy. But in the 1980s, China totally lacked the modern technology, the factories, and the skilled workforce to actually build these cars. Their solution? The joint venture policy, which got heavily cemented during their push to join the World Trade Organization. Western nations really pushed China to open up to a free market. China said yes, but with a massive, game-changing catch. Foreign auto companies could come in, they could access China's incredibly cheap labor and this massive untapped consumer market, but they had to partner 50-50 with local Chinese companies and unconditionally share all of their technology. It's kind of like the toxic X analogy. The deal was so incredibly lucrative, with virtually free land and cheap labor, that giants like Volkswagen, Ford, and Toyota just couldn't resist. They essentially handed over decades of expensive, hard-earned R&D on a silver platter just to get their foot in the door. And we can see how this strategy compounded rapidly over time. In 1984, Volkswagen signs one of the very first major joint ventures. But China didn't just want to blindly assemble cars. They strategically forced local supply chain integration. By 1995, the VW Santana was being built using 90% localized Chinese parts. The steering components, the seats, the airbags, everything was suddenly being made by local suppliers who were literally learning world-class manufacturing standards for free. By the time China officially joined the WTO in 2001, their entire ecosystem was primed. And by 2008, they had completely conquered traditional auto manufacturing, officially becoming the largest car manufacturer in the world. Let's look at part 3, the journey from oil to EV, pivoting to the future. Historically, whoever controls energy controls the future, right? Well, China realized they had a massive blind spot, which was their petrol weakness. They import roughly 75% of their crude oil, spending hundreds of billions of dollars every single year. But even worse, 80% of that oil flows through a tiny geographical choke point called the Malacca Strait. If any kind of geopolitical conflict ever blocked that strait, China's economy would instantly freeze. So to counter this massive vulnerability, they brilliantly pivoted to electric vehicles. It was both a strategic shield and a weapon. By dominating EVs, they aren't just making cars anymore, they're securing energy independence. Today, China controls over 75% of the entire global lithium-ion battery production.
Which brings us to part 4, the Belt and Road Initiative, building a global supply chain monopoly.
So how exactly did China secure the monopoly required to actually build millions of these cheap EVs? Well, it all starts with the raw materials. Even when critical materials like graphite, cobalt, and lithium are mined way over in Africa or South America, a staggering 90% of the world's graphite is shipped directly to China just to be processed. If you're an EV company anywhere else in the world, you basically have to go through China's supply chain to build your car. This means they can essentially create artificial shortages or dictate rock-bottom prices whenever they feel like it. And they achieved this incredible chokehold through the Belt and Road Initiative, or the BRI. They poured $9.3 billion into Indonesia, specifically because it produces over half of the world's nickel. They dumped over $16 billion into South America's lithium triangle. And here's the kicker. They didn't just buy the materials. They offer these developing nations massive infrastructure loans, but with incredibly strict conditions. You want the loan? You must use Chinese banks, Chinese construction companies, and Chinese workers. Plus, to cut cost even further, Chinese companies like BYD and CATL started localizing battery plants right there at the mining sources. All right, part 5. Let's do a comparative analysis with an India v. China case study. A really great way to understand China's unique ascent is to ask why a country like India fell behind, especially when they actually had a head start. India started producing passenger cars earlier in the 1980s, and they joined the WTO 6 whole years before China did. Yet, if we look at 2004, the disparity is just staggering. India was producing about 8.5 lakh, or 850,000 passenger cars a year. Meanwhile, China was churning out 57 lakh, or 5.7 million. That's nearly a 7-fold difference. So what happened? The crucial difference really lies in their opposing domestic policies. India operated under what was known as the license Raj, which was a highly bureaucratic system where businesses basically needed government permission for almost everything. This naturally created limits on production and really discouraged foreign investment. Plus, their education system focused heavily on theoretical knowledge. By contrast, China's one-party system allowed for the streamlined, incredibly rapid execution of long-term policies, totally free from the pressure of 5-year election cycles. And perhaps more importantly, they tied their technical colleges directly to the auto factories. Students would literally learn theory in a classroom and then walk next door to actually build car parts, creating this massive, hyper-skilled workforce practically overnight. Finally, part 6, the catfish effect and the future of the market. Innovate or die. So, how exactly did China turbocharge its local EV brands into these global giants we see today? They used a brilliant strategy called the catfish effect. Imagine an aquarium filled with slow, lazy fish. If you drop a powerful, aggressive catfish into that tank, those lazy fish only have 2 options: start swimming faster and evolve, or get eaten. Around 2013 and 2014, the Chinese government fully opened its doors to Tesla. Up to that point, local Chinese EV brands were honestly pretty complacent. The arrival of Tesla was a very deliberate wake-up call. It forced local companies like BYD, XPeng, and NIO to rapidly innovate their software, their batteries, and their designs, or face total ruin. And the irony here is just absolutely brilliant. Look at this quote from 2011. When asked if he considered BYD a real competitor, Elon Musk actually laughed and said, "Have you seen their car? I don't think they make a good product." Well, by acting as the catfish in China's aquarium, Tesla totally unintentionally forced BYD into an evolutionary sprint, ultimately turning them into one of Tesla's biggest global nightmares today. And the numbers beautifully illustrate the result of all this cutthroat innovation. Back in 2010, Chinese EV brands held about a 10.8% global market share. Fast forward to 2024, and that footprint has completely exploded to 26.6%. In just over a decade, they've more than doubled their global presence by simply out-innovating and outpricing almost everyone else on the board. So how are they practically unbeatable today? Well, it comes down to some very aggressive domestic policies. In China, getting a license plate for a traditional petrol car requires entering a years-long lottery or paying huge fees, while EV plates are handed out for free. The government also pumps massive subsidies directly into the EV ecosystem, allowing these companies to massively overproduce. Crucially, China also completely dominates the production of legacy chips. These are the basic chips needed to run simple car functions like power windows and wipers. Without them, no one is building a car. And finally, because of all this domestic overproduction, Chinese brands are now exporting their surplus vehicles to Europe and Latin America, sometimes selling them at a loss simply to kill off global competition and establish total dominance. Which leaves us with a truly fascinating reality. Right now, there are around 129 EV companies in China, and they are all locked in a brutal, cutthroat domestic price war. Many of them are operating at a massive loss just to stay alive. So here's the ultimate question we want to leave you with. Who is actually going to survive this hyper-expansion by 2030? Is this incredibly aggressive strategy going to lead to total global dominance, or is this massive bubble destined to pop? We would absolutely love to hear your thoughts on this, so let's keep the conversation going down in the comments. Thanks so much for joining us on this explainer, and we'll catch you in the next one.